welcome to our next installment of the Meet Middle-Aged David series. I'm Pastor John Carolus, and it's great to be with you in this digital format as we dive into God's Word. Now, today I'm going to be telling you the next installment in the story of David and his children. We're going to be hearing from a story that's contained in 2 Samuel 13 and 14, and then in the following week, we're going to be looking at what happens after that in 2 Samuel 15. I'm not going to read these chapters out to you word for word. I'm going to tell you the story, and hopefully you can gain from that the narrative enough to follow it along. And then I'll share a couple of specific verses where we hear from some prophetic people in David's life. But to set you up for that, let's just remember where we've been. Back in the beginning of this series, we reflected on the fact that David was chosen by God, established by Him. He amassed great wealth. He had great influence. He expanded the territory of the kingdom. It seemed like David couldn't do anything wrong, but David eventually got older. Eventually, we learn at the end of 2 Samuel that there was a period of time where there was an event where, in almost failing to defeat a giant on the field of battle, sometime before this sequence of events that we've been reflecting on this series, his generals asked him to stay home because they didn't want him to die in battle when he needed to be ruling the country. And so he could command the armies from afar, and then on the final stages of a battle, come to the battlefield and be a part of the victory. So David was at home, and that's what set him up for failure when it came to Bathsheba. He not only violated Bathsheba, he violated his great general and fellow soldier Uriah. He murdered Uriah, had Uriah murdered, and then he took Bathsheba into his home. And we learned last week that no matter what we do, there's no decision we can make, no matter how damaging, no matter how hurtful, that God can't redeem for His good purposes. While we still have to deal with the consequences of those actions in this life, we are not abandoned to our worst instincts, our worst characteristics by God. Instead, He says, even with all of those things about you that make you maybe kind of an impossible person to be with, I love you. And I'm going to use you. Even those worst decisions, I can find ways to bring good out of them. And so we see that in the life of David. We're going to be hearing today a story that brings up likely all kinds of emotions for you. It's an appalling story. It's heartbreaking. It raises more questions than answers, we find. And one of the struggling things we're going to have to deal with is the fact that this story is about David. And even though the characters involve his children and the issues they have with each other, the story is ultimately about how David responds to these things, rather than the resolution that we might seek to find for those particular characters. And we're dealing with some very personal things. We're dealing with sibling rivalries. We're dealing with sexual assault, with violation. We're dealing with murder, with banishment. We're dealing with years and years of unforgiven sins, of unreconciled relationships. And so all of that I just want to acknowledge the weight of, the significance of. But in this story, we're going to find how not only did God's promise through Nathan come true about the realities of the problems in David's family's existence after his decision-making with Bathsheba and Uriah, but we also get to see that even in these darker chapters of David's life, even in these more convoluted, cloudy, and confusing episodes, words of the gospel are spoken. And by gospel, I don't mean necessarily the promise of Jesus coming into the world and saving us from our sins through His death on the cross and resurrection from the tomb. That is contained in this idea of the gospel, but the gospel in the sense of God's merciful word for us. God's merciful word for His servants. God's merciful words for those who have turned their backs against Him. So we're going to hear about that, but first let me take you through the story. If you remember, what we found at the end of the last story is that David took Bathsheba into his home and he married her, and then he had some children with her. This section of the story in 2 Samuel 13 focuses on David's firstborn son, Amnon. Amnon had a half-brother named Absalom. Absalom had a sister, also David's daughter, named Tamar. Absalom and Tamar were full siblings. Amnon was their half-brother. Amnon grew to love and desire Tamar for his own, as well as a partner, as a wife. He was lusting after her. He was desiring her for his own selfish needs, for his own selfish wants. And he knew that it was out of bounds for him to desire his half-sister like that. And so he eventually got to this point where instead of dealing with that, he allowed it to overcome him with this sense of anger, with this sense of conflict within himself. And so his cousin, who really isn't a great guy, influenced him and said, well, why don't you just devise a plan for her to come take care of you while you're sick, and then take advantage of her as she is caring for you, leaning over your bed and caring for you by giving you food and checking your temperature and all of that stuff. And Amnon, not in his best judgment state, decides that's a great idea. So he pleads with David, his father, to send his half-sister Tamar to come check on him because he's sick. In fact, David is so concerned with Amnon's sickness. Remember, this is David's firstborn son, so the emotions and the love there, it's a significant thing. And so he goes and checks on his son, and Amnon says, I think I'll be okay, but why don't you send Tamar to come care for me? I know that if she feeds me, if she takes care of me, I'll get better faster. David, trusting his own children, says that that's a great idea. So he sends Tamar, she goes and takes care of him, and of course, the worst happens. The unspeakable happens when Tamar checks on her brother Amnon. He violates her violently against her will, and we know that this is a great transgression. And then to make matters worse, after the moment is over, the narrative in the Bible tells us that he resents her, he has contempt against her, he hates her even more than how much he wanted her before that event took place, before that violation of her integrity, of her personhood. And she pleads with him. She says, Amnon, don't cast me out because that's actually even worse than what you've just done to me, because now you're abandoning me to be not worthy of being married to anyone. I'm not going to be able to provide for myself. I won't be taken into anyone's home. I'm going to be left destitute if you cast me out like this because of what you've done to me. But Amnon won't listen to her. He shuts her out. He has his servant throw her out of the house forcibly. And she tears her robe off that was representing her virginity. She mourns, she covers herself in ashes, and Absalom, her direct brother, finds her full sibling. Absalom immediately can put the pieces together. He understands what happened, and he says, did your brother violate you? Come into my house, let me care for you. And he provides for his sister's needs for the rest of her life. But Absalom can never look at Amnon the same way again. He can't forgive his brother. He never speaks to him about the event. It is such a terrible thing within himself. The anger is so violent and so forceful that he can't think about his brother the same way. He can't engage in conversation with him the same way. And so for years, this contempt simmers within him. For 2 years, it's cooking within himself. And he knows that he needs to do something about this. And he looks at his father, David, and David understands what's going on, and he's very angry about this, but we don't get any explanation as far as actions that he took to discipline his son. We know that it made him very angry. We know that this likely broke the hearts and confused and made angry the entire household of David. But Absalom decides to take things into his own hands. It was the time of year where the sheep needed shearing, and he wanted to throw a party as his sheep were being sheared when the wool was all finished, when the harvest was done. He invited the king and all of his sons to come to his house for this party. David, the king, said, no, my entourage would be too much pressure for you. I don't want to put that much pressure on you. I'm not going to come to the party. And Absalom says, well, why don't you at least send my brothers, send your other sons, let them come and party with me. And so David agrees, and for whatever reason, Absalom even mentions Amnon, send Amnon, let Amnon come and party with us. And so eventually David sends all his sons to Absalom's house for this sheep shearing party. And he tells his servants, Absalom does, hey, when Amnon gets to the point where he's inebriated, where he's had too much to drink, where he's been enjoying himself, I'm going to give you a signal, and I want you to kill him. Now don't worry. You're not going to be prosecuted for this. The order's coming directly from me. When I give you the signal, kill my brother Amnon. And so the party goes on. The night progresses. The signal is given. Amnon is killed. An uproar erupts. The other sons of David start gathering themselves and jumping onto their animals, and they start fleeing back to Jerusalem, back to the palace. Eventually, some messenger arrives and comes to David and says, Absalom's killed all of your sons. And David doesn't know what to do. He mourns, he tears his clothing, he puts ashes on himself, he cries out to God for mercy. But then another one of those people who was present at the party comes and says, no, it wasn't all your sons, it was just Amnon. Just Amnon was killed. The others made it out alive. As the other sons start to make their way into the city, David realizes that the only son he's lost is Amnon. His heart is broken. His oldest son, his most beloved, maybe his favorite child, is lost to him forever, and he can't reconcile the grief. He grieves for his son. He misses his son. He's angry with Absalom because he knows he's responsible for Amnon's death. Absalom flees to his grandfather, He flees to another nation, Geshur. He flees there and he hides there for 3 years outside of the nation of Israel, outside of David's kingdom. Now, I know these names are starting to get conflicting and confusing, but what you need to know is David's children were not getting along. His oldest son violated his half-sister. That half-sister's direct sibling, brother Absalom, had Amnon killed. David is beside himself with anger, first for Amnon's sin, then for Amnon's death. He's grieving. Absalom flees the country, and for 3 years, Absalom and David live apart. He doesn't bring Absalom back. He knows that if he were to bring him back, he'd have to have him killed in order to exact justice for his angry sin against his brother, his angry murder of his own brother. And eventually, things get to be messy. Joab, David's star commander, his chief general, he recognizes that something has to be done in order for this relationship to be reconciled. He knows that this is eating David alive. He knows that Absalom is well loved by his army, by the people in Jerusalem. The conflict at the highest level of government and highest level of ruling is having a trickle-down effect, and it's not good for the city of Jerusalem. It's not good for the people of David. So Joab devises a plan to convince David to bring his son back. He finds a wise woman who he has dress in grieving clothes, in mourning clothes. She goes to David and she presents this case before him, almost like a parable, like the prophet Nathan did last week with Bathsheba. The woman comes and says, "Hey, I need your help, O king." And he says, "What do you need?" She says, "My husband is dead. My 2 sons were out in the field. They got into an argument. No one else was around. One of them killed the other. The family wants to have that living son put to death because he doesn't deserve the inheritance. And honestly, they're right from a legal point of view. But look at me. I'm grieving one of my sons. The other son is the last member of my family. If they put him to death, my family name is done. It's over. There's nothing left for me in this world. Is there any way you could have mercy on me and my son? Allow him to come into the city and protect him from harm. Is there a place for him to be safe?" David says, "Yes. I'll keep him safe. Not a single hair on his head will be numbered." And so she says again, then she said, and this is 2 Samuel 14, verse 11, she said, "Please swear to me by the Lord your God that you won't let anyone take vengeance against my son. I want no more bloodshed." "As surely as the Lord lives," he replied, "not a hair on your son's head will be disturbed." The woman looks at king and says, "Please allow me to say one more thing of my lord the king." "Go ahead and speak," David responded. She replied, "Why don't you do as much for the people of God, the nation of Israel, the people of David, as you have promised to do for me? You have convicted yourself in making this decision because you have refused to bring home your own banished son." She is referring directly to Absalom's 3-year absence, his 3-year exile, his banishment to the kingdom of Geshur. "All of us must die eventually," she goes on. "Our lives are like water spilled out on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God does not just sweep life away. Instead, he devises ways to bring us back when we have become separated from him." They engage in this conversation for a few more verses. Eventually, David sees through her efforts. He knows that Joab put her up to this. Sorry, let's walk through that again. David recognizes that this woman was put up to this facade, to this play acting by his commander Joab, because he recognizes Joab can see that there needs to be some reconciliation. So he sends for Joab. Joab comes in. He says, "Look, just go get Absalom, bring him back to the city, but he cannot come into the palace. He cannot leave his house." And Joab says, "Thank you for granting this request. I know that we're on good terms because you said yes to this." And that's where we're going to end the story today. David and his son are reconciled. For 2 years, Absalom lives in his own house and never sees his father. And we're going to experience next week what comes of that. Before we get there, let's just reflect on the significance of this story. David's siblings are a wreck. David's children are a wreck. They're siblings with each other. His family is extremely conflicted, extremely plagued with distress. They can't keep their hands off each other, whether it be in inappropriate and violating behavior or murder itself. David's children are at war with each other. And what's David's response? We see that he has emotions about this. He's angry. He's in grief. He banishes his son. He doesn't really know what to do. We don't get clear answers. And this woman, this paid actor has to come and open his eyes to how God would respond to a situation like this. What would a merciful ruler do? Some things can't be changed. David's son has killed his other son. That son deserved to die because he violated his sister. Why didn't David step in? Why didn't David handle that more directly? We don't get the answers to these questions. What we recognize is A, God's pronouncement through his prophet Nathan came to pass. David's house is filled with bloody conflict. Human hearts are plagued by sin. Conflict is there. It's inescapable. You and I, if left to our own devices, oftentimes we would end up in similarly dark places. Now, there are people out there, right? People we know and love, whether they're connected to the church or not, they are great people. They love their neighbors. They care for their families. And so it's not that every single person is a murderer deep down. But what is true is that we would never turn to God on our own. We oftentimes struggle with mercy. We struggle to make wise decisions. When it's people we know and love and care about, judgment can be clouded, and there isn't always a clear answer as to the right thing to do. David certainly was a victim of that reality. His own poor decision-making led to terrible situations in which his family found themselves. And he was left on his own to pick up the pieces. But what I love in this story, and I recognize there's so much that we need to talk about. There's so much that really should be conversed about. And what I want you to hear before I get into this particular textual note, what I want you to hear is if these situations particularly resonate with you on a personal level, if you've experienced some of the things that take place in this story, whether it be violation, whether it be sibling rivalry, maybe it's the result of grief because of loss and conflict, maybe there's broken and unreconciled relationships in your family or in your friendships. These things happen. And church is not a place where only the well-behaved and happy people go. Church is a place where tortured souls like ourselves are collected. Those who suffer, those who don't have all the answers, those who can't pick up all the pieces on their own. And I want you to know that here at Shepherd, this is a place where you're cared for. Whatever you're walking through, whatever you may have experienced in the past, one of the pastors, one of our ministry staff who are trained in listening, in caring, in being there with you, we are happy and we are privileged and we welcome the honor and the opportunity to support you through these kinds of difficult and terrible situations. We know God does not abandon us in these situations, and we don't want to abandon you either. So first of all, let me just say that's an open door invitation. If there is a need that we can support you in through conversation, through companionship, through prayer, make it known to us. Reach out. We will be discreet, we'll be confidential, and we'll pray with you and we'll sit with you. What I also want you to hear today is these words of the widow who came to David. And she says this about God: all of us must die eventually. We're just human beings. Our lives are like water spilled out on the ground that can't be picked back up again. In other words, so many things are out of our control and things are beyond our containing. But God does not just abandon us to that reality. He doesn't just sweep us under the rug or out into the street, out of the house, and leave us banished. Instead, He devises ways to bring us back when we've been separated from Him. That is a beautiful picture of the gospel, of God's commitment to pursuing those who are lost, of God's willingness to go further than we are able of going on our own, to say, you are my child, I love you. I have done everything necessary in order to connect myself with you. Just believe in me. Hear this promise. Turn to me. Let go of those problems of the past. Let go of those situations that are outside of your control. Let go of the weight of your conviction and your guilt. I love you. I have found a way to bring you back to me. I have found a way to make this connection real, that we might walk through life together. No longer separated by your imperfections, no longer separated by your lostness, no longer separated by your sin. Instead, God has found a way. He has devised a way. He has orchestrated a way through His Son, Jesus, to establish a connection with His people like you and like me that lasts forever. Not only through the enduring of suffering seasons in this life, not only of the conflicts that arise because of our poor decision-making, not only the situations that can extend in this earthly lifetime, but forever. There is nothing that can take us out of His hand. The Apostle Paul writes, not even life nor death can separate us from the power and the love of God. And that same promise that this woman who is trying to remind David of his responsibility as a merciful ruler, that same truth holds true for you and for me. God's love counts. And He has found a way to bring back those who are separated from Him. If you find yourself in a season of separation, of distance, I want you to know that God still loves you. And He's still intimately close to you. And if you're in a season of joy and you're in a season of celebration, you are a conduit through which God communicates that same promise to others. Look in your life. Look this week. Pray for your eyes to be opened for those opportunities to share His love with others. God does not leave us in that place of lostness. He does not leave us in the pit of the darkness of our own decisions. He raises us up and says, "You are mine, and I am with you no matter where you go." May God bless you and keep you this week. May you be aware of His presence with you. And as we continue to turn these difficult and confusing pages of the Bible together, may He guide our reflection that we might see even here in these conflicted places the realities of His great love for us through Jesus. It's in His name I say this. Amen. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.